Hello, and welcome to the Water Buffs podcast, featuring in-depth interviews with experts discussing water problems and solutions. You'll find the audio version of this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. The video version is available on YouTube and Vimeo. Water Buffs is a production of The Water Desk, an independent journalism initiative based at the University of Colorado Boulder's Center for Environmental Journalism. Stay tuned until the end for more information. We hope you enjoy the show.
Aerial imagery, whether it's from a drone, from an airplane, or just someone standing on top of a hill, it's a great way to see water resources and understand the issues related to them. This is the Water Buffs podcast. I'm Geoff McGhee, and I work with the Water Desk on data visualization and maps. Today, we're going to talk to Mitch Tobin, the founder and director of the Water Desk. The Water Desk's open source multimedia library offers both still imagery and video footage captured from a bird's eye view. We're going to talk about the Water Desk's partnership with Lighthawk and his own work filming water-related locations with a drone. Hi, Mitch. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Jeff. Thanks very much for having me on the show. I'm excited to talk to you.
Me too. So let's get started. Can you remind us what the Water Desk's mission is and what kind of journalism we're supporting?
Sure. The Water Desk started about a year ago, and our mission is to increase the power and the depth and the impact of water-related journalism. We focus on the western United States and the borderlands of Mexico, and we try to strengthen water journalism in a variety of ways. We give out grants to journalists to support their coverage. We also produce some of our own content. We work with students here at the University of Colorado, where we're based in Boulder, and all of this is meant to increase the number of stories about water issues and the quality of those stories and the impact that the reporting makes in terms of trying to explain these really critical issues to the public.
Well, speaking of that, why do you think aerial images and videos are useful for water journalists?
You know, I think getting up in the air and getting that bird's eye view can really be helpful in terms of understanding water issues. Water moves around, it's used and reused, and so there's almost always a spatial element to water, and it's very critical to understand the lay of the land and where the water is coming from, where it's going, and by being up in a plane or by using a drone, and getting that vantage point, I think it's easier to understand how all of the pieces fit together. And so we have tried to emphasize that in our multimedia library in terms of still images and video footage that we share with folks and allow them to republish for free under a Creative Commons license. And just from personal experience as a reporter working on water issues, over my career, I've taken a number of flights and really felt that that was helpful for understanding how the water systems here in the American West work. And I think it also produces really compelling and sometimes beautiful imagery that can engage audiences and make people care more about these issues.
So I understand the Water Desk has a private jet available for this purpose. Is that correct?
Not quite. We're working on that and trying to get some more funders. We'd also love to have a helicopter, but no, at this point, we don't have our own fleet of airplanes.
Right. Okay. Well, then tell us about the Water Desk partnership with an organization called Lighthawk. How does this work with them and with journalists?
Yes, although we don't have any planes or helicopters at the Water Desk, we do have this amazing partnership with a nonprofit called Lighthawk, and they are able to tap into a network of volunteer pilots who are willing to donate their time, their planes, their fuel, and are able to get journalists up in the air so that they can integrate aerial reporting and aerial imagery into their stories. And so we work closely with them to connect Lighthawk and its pilots to journalists who are working on water issues. And those journalists are able to get on these flights at no cost to them and get up in the air so that they can see things from that bird's eye view. They can take pictures, they can shoot video. And, you know, I think we've seen already a number of cases in which that aerial vantage point has been incorporated into stories, both in the text in terms of reporters describing what they're seeing, and in terms of multimedia, photos and video. And I think that imagery is, very often very engaging and interesting and helps bring people in. And so we at the Water Desk have done 3 flights thus far with Lighthawk and its pilots, most of them fairly close to our home base here in Boulder, but we are now planning in the coming year to do additional flights further down the Colorado River and addressing and covering some of the tributaries that feed into the river. And so for me, it's definitely one of the highlights of the job. I've always loved to fly and look out the window and take pictures. And, we're excited to connect journalists who are working on these issues to Lighthawk so that they can get the same experience.
Yeah, well, walk me through that. Can you tell me about some of the highlights of your trips? And I should say that I had the opportunity to go along with you on one of them back in October, and that was a real thrill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we took 3 flights, and all of them left from Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport, which is in Broomfield between Denver and Boulder. And, for all of those flights, we had aspirations to get over the Continental Divide and see the headwaters of the Colorado River, which are in Rocky Mountain National Park. Now, the first 2 times that we tried that over the summer, we were not able to do that because of the turbulence. And as you might imagine, the Continental Divide, which is 14,000 foot mountains, there can be some pretty strong winds up there and turbulence. And so you're in a smaller plane. So there are limits to what you can do. And any kind of operation in the air using planes like that, you need to be mindful of the weather. And that's sort of a limiting factor sometimes. So
because let's face it, I mean, flying over mountain ranges in a small plane can be downright dangerous, and you have to be very conservative about that. But that seems to have been the case with our pilots, and that's one of the great things about Lighthawk, I think, right?
Yeah. And, anybody who's flown into Denver from the west, even in a large commercial jet, knows that it tends to get bumpy just because of the air currents hitting those huge mountains. But, Lighthawk is super safe in terms of the flights, and the pilots are very experienced. And so they're never going to put us in a situation that's unsafe. So for those first couple of flights, in which we couldn't get over the divide, we stuck to this side of the mountains and went to a variety of different front range water locations. And so we were able to see a variety of canals, reservoirs, water treatment plants, as well as rivers and streams here on the front range in the area between Fort Collins and Denver. We're also able to go up into the foothills southwest of Boulder and did a tour of Gross Reservoir, which has been in the news quite a bit because Denver Water is seeking to heighten the dam that's already there in order to increase the capacity of the reservoir. That reservoir is fed actually by water from the Colorado River Basin that is pumped through the Continental Divide in the Moffett Tunnel. And so we were able to capture some imagery of Gross Reservoir and Gross Dam and are making that available to anybody who wants to use it, whether they're for or against that project to expand the reservoir.
So what should a journalist know before they get on the plane and want to do a shoot?
Well, I think that, first of all, this is not for everybody. Some people don't like to fly even on a commercial flight. And clearly this is a smaller plane, and that may make some people uncomfortable. So, it's not for everybody, but it's a totally safe and a very fascinating experience. And so I would encourage any journalist who's interested in doing this, and in order to support their coverage of water issues, to contact us, and we can talk to them more and connect them to Lighthawk to give them more of the details. But in terms of actually getting up in the air, for things like shooting photo and video, one of the challenges is obviously you're moving. And so anytime you're moving and trying to shoot imagery, that can pose some challenges in terms of getting sharp imagery or getting video in which it's not too shaky. And so I primarily shoot still photos when I'm up in the air, and you can do certain things like increasing your shutter speed so that it's taking images that are less susceptible to shake. For video, people will use things like gyroscopes and stabilizers in order to make the footage less shaky and more smooth. I think another consideration is that it sort of depends on which side of the plane you're on and where the sun is. It's as is the case on the ground. If you're shooting into the sun, you tend to get inferior images compared to when the sun is behind you. But generally you're only on one side of the plane, and so one way to deal with that is that the pilots are very often willing to circle around to give you a different vantage point. And so, I think a lot of the basic principles of photography apply whether you're on the ground or in the air. But I think one of the best advice that I could give to folks is to probably increase your ISO a little bit, and that would allow you to also increase your shutter speed so that you can get sharper imagery.
One thing I'll note is that our pilot, Stephanie, did a very nice job of cleaning the windows on the plane before we got in.
Yeah.
It makes a big difference too.
Yeah, and we, I mentioned that we tried a couple of times to get over the Continental Divide and weren't able to do it with the weather. But finally we were when, Geoff, you were here visiting in October with Stephanie in that flight. And that was really, absolutely gorgeous flight. We flew north from Broomfield up to around Fort Collins and then went up the Cache-la-Poudre River and then over the Continental Divide, circled around that area around Rocky Mountain National Park, and got to see the headwaters of the Colorado River right after a big snowstorm. So it was particularly beautiful, and then came back through the Front Range and also passed over again Gross Reservoir. And so, we've been lucky to have some, really beautiful days to fly, even though a couple times we weren't able to get over the divide.
This is Water Words, a fast explanation of a bit of water lingo. I'm Hannah-Lee Myers. Today's water word is headwaters. You may hear the term headwaters used in a sentence like, the headwaters of the Colorado River are in a marshy meadow in Colorado. The term headwaters refers to an area where a stream or river begins. To be specific, the definition of the word headwaters is the farthest point from where a body of water merges or connects to another. In the case of the Colorado River, the headwaters are in a valley in Rocky Mountain National Park, where water gathers before flowing all the way to Mexico and the Gulf of California. So if you imagine that area where water gathers to become a stream or river, what you might call the source of that body of water, then you're correctly imagining headwaters. Now back to the Water Buffs podcast.
Are there any issues with like flying over something that maybe someone doesn't want you flying over, whether it's a sensitive like an oil refinery or a water project? Are there any permission issues that come up with that?
We haven't run into that yet. Generally I think the planes that we're taking are high enough off the ground where that's not an issue. We can talk a little bit more later about drones, where I think that is more of an issue in terms of restrictions on where you can fly. But certainly the pilots with Lighthawk know where they can and cannot fly. And, we're able to work with them ahead of time to identify the areas that we'd like to see. We plot them out with waypoints on a map, and they're able to figure out the best way to do that.
Yeah, that's right. I remember one of the things that Lighthawk told us was to eat a light breakfast that morning. And so there might be some people who don't do so well flying in airplanes, and maybe they'd be more comfortable operating a drone, shooting more at close range. Of course,
Yeah.
drones aren't just smaller airplanes. They have a different they have cameras built in a lot of the time. They tend to be much closer up, and it's a much different experience. but that's also part of the lineup at the Water Desk. Tell us about drones and how the Water Desk is using drones and how journalists can benefit from that.
Sure. And I guess I'll just say a little bit about motion sickness since it definitely can be an issue in these flights. It has been in several of the flights I've taken over the years, especially if you are looking through a viewfinder and trying to shoot photos or shoot video, because that seems to make it even worse in the same way that reading, for example, in a car while it's traveling down the highway where you're not able to actually look at the horizon, that can really mess with your body and make you susceptible to motion sickness. And so some of the ways that I've dealt with that, number one is Dramamine, a motion sickness medication that a lot of people take. I've also used these wristbands that a lot of people use on cruises when they're on boats or when they're in vehicles trying to avoid motion sickness. They have a little acupressure point on your wrist. And so that is something to be mindful about, especially if you're trying to shoot video. If you're looking through a viewfinder, it can make you much more susceptible. And, it certainly depends on the flight. A couple of the flights that we took did get a little bit bumpy, but the flight that you and I took, Geoff, was pretty smooth. And so I didn't feel any motion sickness for that.
In addition to aerial flights, there's also drones, which I would say fly at a lower altitude and give you a different experience. Can you tell us about how drones fit into the picture for the Water Desk?
Sure. So I've been a drone pilot for the past few years. It's something that I've really been excited to explore. It's a fascinating field that's growing by leaps and bounds. I've actually got my drone here that I can show you. This is a Mavic 2 Zoom, which I've had for the last year and a half. And it's a really interesting piece of technology. The wings can actually here collapse and make this into a very small aircraft that you can fit pretty easily just in a day pack. You can see here, this is where the camera is. It shoots 4K video, so super high resolution. This drone also has a zoom capability in its lens. And, I think clearly it's much easier to just take one of these drones and put it up in the air rather than getting in a plane and going to an airport and dealing with all of that. Now, there's some big differences clearly between using a drone versus using a plane. Generally speaking, when I'm flying my drone, I can't be any more than 400 feet above ground level. And so compared to a plane, which may be many hundreds or thousands of feet higher than that, it definitely gives you a different vantage point. On the other hand, I can certainly maneuver into tight spaces and hover and do things that a plane could never do. So there's pros and cons to using drones versus planes. And I think the key is to just try to play to the strengths of each of those platforms, if you will, for shooting imagery. And so I have been trying to use the drone in order to film water-related locations here in Colorado primarily, also in Utah and Arizona over the winter break. And so I've been going to rivers, to reservoirs, and trying to get the drone up in the air to give a perspective of what those places look like from the air. And I think very often it can provide a kind of interesting, engaging view of places and to some extent put the viewer's eyes where they wouldn't otherwise be, which is something that photographers and videographers are always trying to do to get that sort of interesting perspective. And so, I think it can be very interesting to see rivers, streams, lakes, reservoirs from above and to see how they're situated in the landscape. And so I've been moving around the Colorado area as well as some other states, trying to find some interesting places to fly the drone. And as with the footage and photos that we shoot via Lighthawk, we make that all available for free on our open source multimedia library.
Tell me about the Captain Jack Mill area. That's actually a Superfund site that you flew over. What do you see there, and what do we get from a drone with that?
Yeah, so one of the first times that we used the drone for the water desk was to capture some imagery for a story that our intern Julia had done on a Superfund site that is in the foothills west of Boulder, called the Captain Jack mine. And, that is a very difficult place to actually photograph or see from the ground level, and to access. But I was able to get pretty close to the mine and get my drone up in the air and look down on the site. You can see this sort of discolored pond there that has some of the waste and the toxic chemicals that are associated with that mine that is very old. And that mine actually had caused some pollution in Left Hand Creek, killed fish. And so using the drone was really the only way for me to be able to get the lay of the land and to sort of show what that Superfund site looked like. We could have potentially also flown over that. It would have been a little challenging just because it's a fairly small site, would have passed by it pretty quickly. So in this case, the drone seemed to be the right tool for the job.
So as a drone pilot, that's not just a something you say. You're literally like certified as a pilot. How does that work? How do you go to drone school?
Yeah, so the deal with drones is that folks who are just using it recreationally for fun don't need to be certified. But if you are using your drone for any commercial purposes, and journalism would be included under that, you are supposed to be certified by the FAA. And basically that entails taking a written test that examines your knowledge on a whole variety of different issues, things like the weather. A big part of it is understanding the airspace and where you can and can't fly, reading aviation sectional maps. And so if you are interested in using a drone for commercial purposes, for journalism, or for other types of business-related activities, you are supposed to get this certification. And so there are a whole lot of test preparation books and courses. And, it does require some studying. It's not something that you can just take without, putting in some time to understand the rules and regulations. But I think if you do, it's not that hard to pass if you're willing to just put in the time. And so, basically you're able to then use your drone for commercial purposes, and you get a license from the FAA. You have to retake the test every 2 years. And so, it is a little bit of a hurdle, but it's not too bad in terms of the amount of time that you have to invest in it.
In terms of stories and in terms of how drones can inform your reporting, the most obvious use is something that's become almost a bit of a visual cliche now, which is the big sort of aerial flyover full screen montage that tops a lot of feature stories. And honestly, those are great scene setters. I mean, it's a reason that it's been kind of a cliche in Hollywood movies that during the opening credits, you've got like the helicopter shot zooming in on the car on the freeway. But cliches aside, it's also an extraordinary way to really get the sense of a place that can be hard to get from the ground level. And I think about a friend of mine, Eric Olson, a colleague of mine in video at the New York Times, who recently published some drone shots that he did of almond orchards in the southern San Joaquin Valley. And why is that necessary? We know what a tree looks like. But do you know what a million trees looks like, all growing the same crop and all set in this highly industrialized, highly human-shaped landscape? Just the enormity of it, the context of it, and just the real scale is something that the drone brings across so brilliantly.
I think you make a good point. You do very often see these scene-setting views, as you describe them, that are really helpful for grounding the reader in the location that the story is taking place. And, once you start flying a drone and using it to shoot photos and video, you then start to see that photo and video style everywhere: commercials, television programs, movies, and increasingly in journalism. And I think, you are seeing it so widely used because it has a lot of advantages of being able to give you that bird's eye view and give you an overview of an area that you could never get from the ground. And you mentioned things like filming tons of trees in an orchard. That's something that I'm always looking for, patterns and interesting visuals from the air. And, if you were just walking in an orchard, you wouldn't see that. But from the air, you can see a very interesting perspective. And so things like, flying over rivers and seeing the patterns in the soil and the gravel bars and, what's referred to as the fluvial geomorphology, if we want to get technical, how rivers move through the landscape. Really a drone, an overhead view is the great way to do that. And so I think it provides an interesting vantage point and perspective, and it makes otherwise maybe dull landscapes a whole lot more interesting.
It reminds me, there's folks at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln who've set up a drone journalism program, and they're helping people explore ways to use drones for coverage. And they're extremely useful, particularly in crisis situations, whether it's a flood or a wildfire, although you don't want to fly your drone around when there's responders there. Just really a valuable way of assessing the damage and getting people to places to take in the totality of it that they couldn't otherwise.
Yeah, I think some of the most compelling drone footage that I've seen have been of disasters, unfortunately. But, the many wildfires that we've suffered here in the United States and elsewhere, flooding, being able to look down on that really gives you a sense of the scale and the scope. But, as you mentioned, if you are flying a drone, you really need to be careful if you are doing it in the context of a natural disaster, and especially in terms of things like wildfires. And so there's been a huge education campaign that the federal government and others have been pursuing to try to stop people from flying their drones if there is a fire. When there is a fire, they typically create a temporary flight restriction around that area because planes and helicopters are one of the main ways that we fight fires today in terms of laying down retardant, using helicopters to drop water. And so you definitely do not want to have a drone in that environment where you have a lot of planes and helicopters flying at low altitudes. And so the typical procedure is for there to be a temporary flight restriction set up around wildfires or around natural disasters to prevent drone pilots from flying there and from endangering the other aircraft in the area. And so that's something I feel really strongly about. I think a lot of drone pilots worry that a few bad apples are going to, ruin it for the rest of us who are trying to follow the rules. And so it also comes up in the water context that there are certain areas where you are not allowed to fly a drone. So, for example, a national park, certainly beautiful scenery would look awesome from a drone's vantage point, but drones are not allowed to be flown in national parks or in wilderness areas. I just recently took a trip down to Glen Canyon Dam around Page, Arizona, and drones are not allowed there around that dam because it's critical infrastructure. There's also Glen Canyon National Recreation Area where it's illegal. And so there are plenty of places where it would be cool to fly a drone and where you capture interesting imagery, but it's simply not allowed. And that's one of the main emphasis in terms of becoming certified as an FAA drone pilot is understanding the rules of the airspace and where you can and cannot fly.
There's a lot of humorous and not so humorous drone disasters that happen. It probably is kind of hard to fly something remotely, to do it through a smartphone, to control it with a joystick or whatever you use. How do you do that, and how hard is it to keep a drone from getting into trouble?
Yeah, so with the Mavic line, this is the controller, and you can see basically you use the cell phone as the display. There are other models. The previous one that I had a different setup than this. There's some that come with built-in displays. But basically
that's your phone in there that we're looking at.
Yeah, so this is my phone that connects in
the
here,
black mirror there. Okay, got it.
So this is just a regular cell phone, and there are two joysticks here, and these allow you to control your altitude, which direction you're heading, the speed, etc. And then there's a screen here that provides a whole variety of data, as well as the screen here that is showing you the imagery that is being captured in real time, as well as important variables like your battery strength. So there's just a ton of information that it provides. It can be a little bit nerve-wracking. I mean, I must say that, the drones aren't necessarily cheap. The setup that I have is probably about $1,500. And, certainly if the drone falls from the sky, it's going to be in a world of hurt and probably destroyed. Now,
And don't try to catch it, right?
right. Yeah, that could be dangerous. Another issue is running into things. And certainly if you Google, drone fails or drone crashes, you'll find many, many compilations of drones smashing into buildings, into trees. And so, you have to treat this as an aircraft, and it's not really a toy, and you have to, learn how to use it and practice it and always be aware of your surroundings. Now, with photographing water issues, it's a little bit of a challenge, or maybe a little extra anxiety, in the sense that if I'm flying over a reservoir or over a river and the drone crashes, it's going to the bottom of that reservoir, the bottom of that river. Now, if the drone crashes and I'm able to recover it, I do have an insurance policy through DJI, the manufacturer.
Drone insurance.
Yeah. So, and that's become a common thing because, drones do crash and they're expensive. And so if you're able to recover the aircraft and then send it back to them, you have to pay a deductible, but it certainly is worth your while. But if you're flying over a body of water, it's going to be much harder to recover that. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely worth taking time to practice in sort of low stakes environments and really become comfortable with the aircraft, because as soon as the drone gets more than 10 or 20 feet above the ground, it's in a position where if it were to lose power because you weren't paying attention to the battery, or or if you were to hit something like a tree branch, it would come crashing down, and that would be bad. Another piece of technology that I've just started to use are these goggles that I have here, and I'll just show you how they work. Basically, put them on your head, and then you will then see the perspective of the drone through the camera. And on the one hand, that can actually be make it easier to fly because you're able to see, in some cases, more clearly than you can through the cell phone, especially if it's a bright day. On the other hand, you really should have a spotter when you're doing that, because if you're looking through the drone's perspective, you're not actually looking at the drone, and you're supposed to maintain visual contact with the drone at all times and making sure that you're not running into anything.
So wait a minute. Do you control it by like tilting your head like an Oculus kind of thing, or you're still using the joystick underneath?
You can use the joystick underneath, but I believe there is an option, I have not tried it yet, where you can change the perspective or the view of the drone simply by moving your head. And so it's a lot of fun. I've only had this for a short while, and I'm still getting used to it. But it's a really interesting kind of view or perspective in these what are referred to as immersion goggles. But it does take some getting used to.
And you're completely blinded to whatever objects might be around you. So if you're on the edge of a cliff or something like that where you launch your drone, then you've got to be very careful.
Yeah. And these are not gigantic aircraft. So as you might imagine, something that is only, this big, if it is 400 feet up in the air, it is very hard to see, especially if it's not directly above you. And so that is always a challenge, and that's why a lot of drone pilots have visual spotters who work with them so that you can have a team with one person controlling the motion of the drone and one person making sure that it stays out of harm's way.
I guess it's fair to say that one of the things that drone photography or drone imagery and aerial imagery have in common is really lousy sound. So not really much to listen to at that point. what do you recommend about that? Is that just sort of a normal part of the convention that you just don't use the soundtrack? And I think sometimes in broadcast news they'll even like lay in some helicopter background sound just to explain how you're seeing something. Is there a convention that we have for that?
At least in the work that I've done, it's all been without any audio because the whirring of the propellers would just be a droning sound, and so there's not even any audio in terms of what I'm recording. Perhaps there are some drones and technology out there that will capture it, but it's very challenging to be that close to those propellers, and so it is a silent movie, so to speak, and it's all visual. But on the other hand, that in some ways makes it easier in terms of editing the video. Anybody who's worked with video knows that sound is a huge part of it and requires a lot of work. Thankfully, with a drone, you just don't have to deal with that.
It reminds me that one of the most amazing things about an eagle or a hawk cam from the Alps, someone attached an action camera to a hawk, and then that recorded sound, as I understand it, and what you hear is silence. You hear the wind, and then you hear a lot of wind when it dives. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be interesting. You mentioned birds. That is another issue to consider. Birds do notice when there are drones, and I've had that happen a number of times, and even to the extent that I immediately landed because I was worried that there was going to be a collision between the drone and the bird, which would be bad news for both of them, I think. And so... What's that?
Nobody wins in that confrontation.
Nobody wins, right? I think that's that's going to end poorly, I think, on both sides, and so that is something to be aware of. And certainly, you don't want to be harassing wildlife or doing anything like that. On the other hand, I think I've seen quite a few stories about biologists and other scientists who are using drones as a way to study wildlife and to do other science. People are using it in the context of wildfires to try to get a view of where the fire is. And so, the sky's the limit, so to speak, in terms of drone technology. And it can in some ways be a less invasive and certainly less costly way to handle some of these things. Search and rescue is another application that's delivered some really impressive results.
To think about the difference between drones and aerial imagery, it's almost like the aerials, you move so fast. I was just amazed when we took off from Rocky Mountain Airport and we were up, crossing the Front Range along the Rockies so quickly. And then before we knew it, we were over the Continental Divide. That was a trip that we'd spent 6 hours doing in a car the day before so that we could shoot the drone shots. Your time scale is totally different. It's almost like an aerial photo is like in golf, which I don't play. I believe you use a driver to whack the ball as far as you can and really make a lot of distance. And then you use your putter for your sort of fine-grained close-ups. And maybe there's a little bit of that kind of relationship between aerials and drone shots too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you're flying in an airplane, that is a challenge that typically these are flights in airplanes rather than helicopters, so you're not able to hover. You're constantly moving forward. And so it can be a little bit of a challenge because you may only have a very short period of time in order to capture the imagery that you want. And so, that can be a consideration, whereas with a drone, you're able to hover, you're able to get very close to things. And it's certainly a much more maneuverable than a plane is. And so, I think, your analogy is good in the sense that each of those tools is meant for different purposes. They each have strengths and weaknesses, and I think they're both valuable, but it's a matter of finding the right tool for the job.
Random question. Has anyone ever tried to do this with balloons?
I don't know about that. That would be interesting. I'm not sure how well you could control the balloon in terms of its position in the sky. The really amazing thing about these drones is that you can be, several hundred feet up in the air and it can be fairly windy, but because of the technology of the GPS and the other sensors that are on these drones, it's pretty rock solid and pretty steady. And the camera that are mounted on these drones are typically on a gimbal, sort of a gyroscope that stabilizes them. And so As you might imagine, the higher you get up in the air, the more wind there is. And, at a certain level, it can be too windy to fly a drone. But even when there's, a decent breeze, these devices are really able to stay very steady and deliver smooth video, which is really impressive.
Which reminds me, they have another feature, don't they? Like, you can basically, at a certain point, if all is lost, you hit a button and they'll just come right back home to you?
Yeah, mine has a return to home feature is what it's called. And so you basically just hit it and it will know where it took off from based on the GPS coordinates and will, land right where it took off. And so that can, definitely be helpful. And there are also other automated features that these drones have where you can have it fly a certain pattern, go to certain waypoints. One of the challenges is when you're flying the drone is while you're moving it to have that motion be super smooth, which is critical for video. And so, it's one thing to just be moving forward. You can more or less control the speed, but if you're trying to turn while you're moving forward or trying to move up, it requires really fine movements in terms of the joystick. One of the ways that you can deal with that is to actually program the drone and have the computer and, in a sense, the autopilot do that for you.
Well, I don't know if podcasts have a return to home button, but I guess the best thing we have is the old journalistic cliche of a look ahead. So what's next for the aerial imagery at the Water Desk, and how can journalists learn more and take advantage of these resources?
Yeah, so I'm excited just to continue to find locations throughout the Colorado River Basin where I can fly the drone and capture imagery, and we'll be continuing to add that to our multimedia library, which we make available to anybody to use under a Creative Commons license. I mentioned that I took a trip over the winter break all the way down to Glen Canyon Dam and Lee's Ferry, essentially the dividing line between the upper basin and the lower basin. And so I was able to visit a variety of different locations, and I'm just now working on editing that footage and that imagery. Whenever I'm able to, I like to get out there and explore new possible areas. I think it sometimes requires multiple tries at a single location to get the best video or photo. I mean, that's true, whether you're using a drone or whether you're standing on the ground, in terms of the lighting, the weather. And so I've been gradually building up a whole long list of locations where it's interesting and fun to fly the drone. And so I'm always looking for new places, but also interested in going back to places where I've already flown, just looking for that, great light, the sunset, the clouds, which is sort of hard to predict.
Great. Well, I think that it's going to be really interesting to see how journalists find these resources useful, and also interesting to think how partnerships could possibly help create collaborations where we can get useful imagery for stories that people are working on and help bring viewers closer to these issues that are so critical to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if there are any journalists who are working on water issues in the Colorado River Basin, surrounding areas, and who do want to integrate drone footage, I'm always happy to tackle that. It's one of the things that I like most about my work. And so, would encourage you to contact us and see how we can help.
Thanks, Mitch. So be careful up there in the air with Lighthawk. And if anybody happens to see a Water Desk drone flying overhead, give us a wave.
Sounds good. Well, thanks very much, Geoff. It's been great talking to you.
Thanks for coming on the show. It's been great to have you. And that's this edition of the Water Buffs podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again.
Thanks for tuning in to the Water Buffs podcast, available in audio and video formats on most major media platforms. Water Buffs is a production of the Water Desk, an independent journalism initiative based at the University of Colorado Boulder's Center for Environmental Journalism. You can learn more about us and about water issues at waterdesk.org. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you have a comment or have a question, please feel free to email us at waterdesk@colorado.edu. Special thanks to the executive producer and co-manager, Hannah Lee Myers, and to our graphic designer and co-developer, Geoff McGhee. Be sure to check out our other episodes, and until next time, thanks for tuning in.